mois après le lancement d'une opération militaire dans le sud d'Irlande afin de stabiliser la région et mettre fin aux exactions des milices tantales, le pays fait aujourd'hui face à une vaste offensive Mercure qui fait craindre le pire.
Nuit de terreur dans l'est d'Irlande après d'intenses bombardements de l'artillerie Mercure.
One could easily believe all that, but these new reports are fictitious. Created for a military exercise named Orion, the largest to be carried out on French soil for 30 years. Conceived 3 years ago, this joint and allied training exercise took place in France at the beginning of 2023. Over more than 20 departments with almost 20,000 soldiers participating. The aim? To prepare for a modern conflict, which could devolve into high-intensity warfare. A prospect that is no longer the stuff of science fiction, now that state-on-state war has returned to the European continent. Take a look with us, behind the scenes, at this extraordinary exercise. I'm going to brief you on the concept of operations for the initial entry in the third dimension, the airborne operation that will take place in the HCAST area. I give the green light now, and after that it's like at NATO. It's a silence procedure. I simply carry out a conditions check, the two components talk to each other, and they get back to me. If at any point they have any doubts or need me to confirm something. But as soon as the tactical and weather situation is along the line you've just described to me, it's a green light forwards. We're moving away from what we've been doing for the past 20 years. We're in a different scale of war. We're in a different operating tempo, so we don't spend too much time in meetings to make decisions. Otherwise, we won't act in due time. So in this case, I've given a green light, and that green light remains valid, unless at some point we see that the weather has deteriorated. The maneuver has changed, the enemy has changed. It wasn't what we had planned. There's a change in planning. And this change in planning has an impact on the whole war. At that point, we work again, we plan again, but otherwise, it's fine. Okay? February 2023, in the south of France. Beginning of the operations, Exercise Orion is launched. This exercise is a milestone for the kind of training we have conducted so far, and it acknowledges the fact that our strategic context has changed, that we're now in a context where we will face much tougher conflict. We can see this today in Eastern Europe between Ukraine and Russia. So that's what we assessed, the fact that the nature of conflicts has changed, and that we have to train for the kind of wars we thought we were forgotten or unlikely, but have become a possibility again. That's what this exercise is all about. The scenario: an attack on a fictitious country, Ireland, by its neighbor, Mercury, supported by militias. The exercise is played out in 4 phases. After a period of planning, an airborne and an amphibious intervention in the attacked country. Then a period of civil-military crisis management, and a high-intensity confrontation on the battlefield. Orion began with an air-maritime initial entry campaign. In other words, the amphibious and airborne projection of armed forces onto the destabilized territory. This capability is difficult to acquire because it requires a certain amount of technical knowledge and tactical skills, in particular what we call power projection. That is to say, the ability to strike the enemy setup in its depth before projecting our forces, aircraft, soldiers or ships. Not all nations are capable of this. France is one of the few countries in the world capable of carrying out precisely this type of operation because it has the troops trained to do that, and above all, because it has the resources to do so, whether through air projection or maritime projection. Orion is designed to prepare the armed forces for high-intensity combat against the peer enemy. To understand what high intensity is, I think we need to look at the semantics or physics. High intensity is the ratio of energy and duration. We imagine energy, namely violence, fire, the associated material and human losses, and the duration. The longer this violence lasts, the greater the losses and the greater the problems to a country, a nation. Interstate wars had truly disappeared, meaning that the format was more of an expeditionary contingent. So it was the OPEX format for the French armed forces. So a small contingent would deploy at the request of another state in order to support it against a non-state actor, an armed terrorist group, the GATT, as we encountered in Operation Barkhane. Here we have been preparing ourselves since the 2010s, including the terms of the vocabulary we use for the return to high-intensity warfare, particularly in the wake of the Arab Spring. With the conflicts we saw in the Middle East, which were no longer really counter-insurgency ones, we saw the emergence of a type of conflict with the re-emergence of urban warfare. And February 2022 marked the return of a state-on-state war to Europe, something quite unprecedented. As a date, the end of February 2022 is for Europe comparable to the 11th of September 2001 for the USA, because it is the return of a type of warfare that has all the characteristics of history repeating itself, or something we experienced in the 20th century in Europe. Orion was devised in 2019-2020, so we should not necessarily try to compare the situation we're trying to reproduce in Exercise Orion with what is happening today in Ukraine. That's not quite the objective. However, we have obviously looked at the way in which the conflict is unfolding in Ukraine. And there are certainly tactical developments on the ground that should be of interest to us. So all these components of the conflict have obviously been analyzed and sequenced, so that we can test our capabilities and confront these different challenges during Exercise Orion. Armed conflicts in an interstate format that correspond to these high-intensity characteristics are quite hard to find in recent memory. We have to look further back in history to the battles of the Second World War, in particular on the Eastern Front, with the cities of Ukraine already at the center of the clashes, but also those of the First World War. Because the longer this high-intensity conflict lasts, the more difficult it is to produce high-tech capabilities, and the more we return to a classic form of confrontation. This is why we see the return of artillery as the queen of battles in Ukraine. Until the end of the Second World War, until the emergence of nuclear deterrence. It used to be the typical model of warfare, and you can go as far back as ancient times. There were confrontation between city-states, confrontation between states, between armies, even if there were mercenaries, and that's another story of warfare. Since the end of the 1990s, there have been decades of asymmetrical combat in which stabilization operations and the counterterrorism operations have been the priority for armies. They are now preparing for tougher conflicts in all domains of war, what the military call multi-domain, multi-field. It's a way of theorizing the battle space. That is to say, that the three natural geographic dimensions, the maritime, air, and land domains, we have finally added other dimensions. We have already added two domains, the cyber and the space one, and two fields, the informational field and the electromagnetic field, which is certainly the least well-known, perhaps the most difficult to grasp. So from 3 dimensions, we move to 7 dimensions. We are realizing, with our capabilities and technological prowess, that we're capable of exploiting domains on a much wider scale than in the past, which in terms of the conflict represents additional threats. The exercise incorporates this multi-domain, multi-field dimension at every level, from headquarters to the battlefield. In an exercise, in an operation, there are always 3 levels of decision. There is a strategic level, which is the level where we design and set the political objectives of the operation. There's a tactical level, which is the battlefield or combat level. Then there's an operational level, which is the level we're at here, and which is the level at which the campaign is managed. So the main difficulty at the operational level is coordinating the actions of all the components that contribute to the maneuver. Land, air, maritime, cyber, space, logistics, and in the field of information warfare, not forgetting special forces. This is one of the new features. For the first time, soldiers are training for full-scale information warfare. In the enemy camp, no holds are barred.
Moi, je dispose d'un compte.
I have a social media account for each of the two enemies I represent. And I also have a website, which is managed like a press room, where I publish press releases. What's special about these channels, and this is what's interesting for the participants, is that I don't apply rules that the French forces apply. I play an enemy that doesn't operate, as we would in a democracy, precisely in order to train our forces. The enemy is allowed to do different things, so he's creating propaganda by deploying narratives that will be hostile to France, threatening narratives to destabilize France. The aim is to win hearts and minds, and therefore influence the population to turn it against France.
Et donc d'influencer une population pour qu'elle soit hostile à la France.
Over the last few months and years, particularly in the Sahel and in Africa, we have seen that if we're not careful, certain lies, certain manipulations of information translate in a very concrete way in the physical domain by hindering our freedom of action. This was demonstrated in the Voie Sacrée convoy, a logistic convoy traveling between Abidjan and Gao in November 2021, which was blocked several times simply because of accusations made against the French army, stating that the convoy was carrying ammunition and weapons for the armed terrorist groups. The local people, who believed this false information, wanted to stop the convoy to check it out, which was not possible for security reasons.
On a vu se développer ces derniers temps, c'est donc un usage planifié.
What we've seen developing recently is a planned and coordinated use, particularly by players like Wagner or simply the Russians, who industrialized the production of information and who turned the internet and smartphones into a weapon.
L'outil du smartphone, une arme.
In other words, disinformation is going to reach everyone on their own personal devices and trap them in an information bubble that will be reinforced by algorithms. The idea, therefore, is to find ways of bursting this bubble, in which citizens, including our soldiers, including our military personnel, could be subjected to influence and have doubts instilled in them as a result of this disinformation.
S'instiller en eux en raison de cette désinformation.
Throughout the exercise, the soldiers are immersed in a digital and information environment, simulated for the occasion.
La lutte informationnelle dans l'exercice Orion.
Information warfare in exercise Orion is something experimental, completely experimental, which we tested thanks to the support of a company called Chrysotech, which provided us with a number of tools and platforms to be able to simulate and moderate this information environment. This is the first time that we have generated such an environment as part of an exercise. It's the first time. We've never gone so far in simulating and moderating the information environment and information warfare. We're here to set up the simulation of the information environment and to animate it. So we run the red side, and we also run the whole information spectrum consisting of public opinions, French newspapers, the media, and so on. All this works with around 25,000 bots operating on the platform, which have generated 282,000 responses on the system since the start of the exercise. On the ground, too, media actions are combined with psychological pressure from the enemy, such as demonstrations, tagging, or the sending of leaflets inciting hatred. The first thing we expect from a unit that finds that it has been the victim of propaganda is that it reports that it has seen something. So in practical terms, participants are physically equipped with dedicated mobile phones to take interesting images that can be reused by the level above them, from tactical up to strategic. And it's on the basis of the analysis that will enable us to determine how dangerous this false information is, so that we can put in place tactics or counter-strategies that will enable us to develop messages that will counteract the enemy's false information. In fact, producing content comes down to carrying out very different actions. There's the ability to document what we're doing with the challenge of transparency and even speed. In other words, being able to very quickly produce images as evidence. For example, to disprove accusations. This is what we did in April 2022 with the Gossi mass grave case, where we highlighted an information warfare attack conducted against the French army by Wagner mercenaries. And the best weapon in the fight against information manipulation and information attacks is the freedom of the press. It's allowing journalists to do their job. Orion also enabled us to work on interoperability with several of France's partners, as well as on our ability to play the role of framework nation, a crucial issue for high-intensity warfare. Acting in a coalition means acting with allies, either within the Atlantic Alliance or the European Union, or within a coalition that we call ad hoc. That is to say, with countries that are ready to alongside us in the particular circumstances faced, as we already do in a number of theaters. Being a framework nation means being the nation that will command the operation and, in particular, provide the means of command to command the operation. And that, too, is one of the rare capabilities which are available to the French armed forces. Indeed, this kind of operation, which is extremely demanding, extremely complex, can only be done with allies. We all have rather phenomenal capabilities, quite significant capabilities, but only the integration of each of these capabilities within a single command, which is French in this case since we're the framework nation, will give us sufficient mass to enable us to defeat an adversary. Of the 12,000 soldiers commanded by Lieutenant General Gaudin for the confrontation phase in eastern France, 1,700 are foreign soldiers of 14 different nationalities. An unprecedented commitment.
À l'issue, nous aurons à peu près 30 minutes de chargement.
So large-scale combat operations are the most complex operations that we conduct. So if we can master these operations, then we can operate at any level, including contingency and stability and support operations. If we've learned anything from history, it's that alliances are critically important. We live in a world that is increasingly interconnected, diplomatically, politically, socially, economically, and militarily. These exercises allow us to develop the interoperability and the understanding to shoot, move, and communicate on the battlefield. The more that we train and better understand each other, both culturally as well as our systems, we're better able to fight together as an alliance.
Ok les gars, je vous explique.
Certainly, in any case for a small country like Belgium, we will very rarely commit forces on our own, so we will generally be part of a coalition. And for that, there is nothing else we can do. We have to train together to put in place procedures that everyone understands, and also put in place technical bridges that allow us to talk to each other, to communicate, and that can only be done with regular training. When we talk about interoperability, we think of radios that simply have to be able to talk to each other, but in fact, it's much more than that. Above all, I think it's interpersonal interoperability, so we have to be able to understand who we're going to be working with, be able to understand the cultural differences, and finally, be able to really collaborate and get the best out of each other. It's not just a military challenge, it's a national one. Orion also incorporates a civilian dimension. In other words, all the state services that could be affected by the imagined conflict to study their ability to resist and to sustain our armed forces.
Les enjeux politiques et sociaux.
We summarize the political and social issues involved in preparing for high-intensity warfare in a notion, a concept,
qui est celui de résilience de la nation,
which is that of resilience of the nation. The main idea is that despite a powerful, strong, rapid attack from an actor, with all its components, our state, our forces, should be able to withstand this first attack.
Notre État, nos forces, soient capables de résister à cette première attaque.
Et c'est une des raisons pour lesquelles, dans l'exercice Orion,
That's one of the reasons why in Exercise Orion at the very beginning, a civil-military phase was planned, because it was clear to the developers of the exercise that we couldn't project ourselves into this fictional situation with only a military commitment. We had to think in terms of the national mobilization around it. And what's interesting is that we came across an initiative from the Secretary General for Defense and National Security, who worked on the National Resilience Strategy.
Travailler sur la stratégie nationale de résilience.
Mr. Cabinet Director, thank you for honoring us with your presence for this major interdepartmental exercise, which is therefore indeed part of Exercise Orion, which was intended to show that alongside the Armed Forces Ministry, the linchpin of Exercise Orion, the whole of the state, central administrations, but also territorial administrations and, as we have seen, local authorities, citizens and associations must be able to mobilize in order to support a war effort, which would not only take place abroad, but would also have an impact on our national territory and on the functioning of our society. I think that a state ability to assert itself against its competitors, adversaries, and enemies does not depend solely on the competence of its armed forces, but also on the competence or performance of the apparatus of state that determines and will determine success. We discovered with the COVID crisis after the initial trial and error period that in fact our country, our society, our people possessed extraordinary resources to organize themselves, coordinate themselves, and ensure that even when we were in lockdown, we still managed to feed ourselves, get treatment for ourselves, and provide a certain number of services. In a high-intensity conflict, it has to be the same. There are legal issues. Do we requisition? Do we draw up contracts? How do things work? What is the legal framework? There are logistical issues. Which companies are capable of supplying trucks, trains, planes? There are also inventory issues. We've talked a lot about war economy, and in fact, there are two aspects to it. The first is the need for the defense industry to be able to produce more, faster, and in better circumstances. This means that, in legal terms, we also need to be able to amend legislation to enable it to work harder and provide a certain amount of material. And then there's the other aspect, which is to organize our economy, to correct our public procurement rules, to ensure that when faced with an exceptional situation, an emergency situation, we can act and react quickly, and not get bogged down by standards or procedures that are useful and even necessary in times of peace, but which in times of crisis get in the way, waste time, and risk costing lives.
Deux packs ennemis, juste sur la butée. Là, 5 mètres, mais je sais pas si y en a un qui est mort ou pas.
In addition to adapting the laws and standards, Orion is also a way of measuring the importance of the National Reserves, an essential reinforcement in high-intensity scenario. Many reservists were mobilized during the exercise.
C'est une grande chance d'être là.
It's a great opportunity to be here. We worked with the military working dog regiment. We got a lot of feedback from the soldiers who were there. We got a lot of information about what they were doing. I discovered some regiments, how they worked, how things were set up, how they were spread out over the camps, how they worked in the field. It's the first time I've seen that. I think it's really important to have reservists, especially in exercises like this, because we're the first link between civilian life and the army, the nation and the army. It allows us to talk to people on a day-to-day basis who don't know anything at all about the army. It helps us to make them aware of it, because people can have a lot of preconceptions about the army. And then people actually ask us questions, and we answer them because we're part of it. And now I'll be able to answer them in more detail, because I know a bit more about the terrain and all the regiments that are here. Leo is a broadcasting student. Matthew has just finished studying finance and now wants to enlist. Having been reservists for 1 year, they volunteer to take part in the exercise. As reservists, we serve in a variety of ways. Missions, such as checkpoints to control enemy vehicles, area surveillance and intelligence missions, and combat missions, where we have to seize hidden ammunitions, for example, or go into direct combat. What I really enjoyed about the Orion mission was working with the Allies, our British, American, Belgian comrades, and others, seeing different vehicles that as reservists we don't get to see very often, and experiencing high-intensity missions. I really enjoyed it.
Les réservistes sont des gens qui ils sont pas importants, ils sont essentiels en fait.
Reservists are not just important, they're essential for our exercise and also for our everyday life and our operations in general.
De l'ordre de 1000 ici sur le.
I have about 1,000 of them here on this operation. They are employed in several roles. Firstly, I have a lot of staff officers and staff non-commissioned officers who are specialists in certain areas, who are fully integrated into the staffs at all levels, whether at corps, divisions, brigade, or regiment level.
Et deuxième temps, j'ai des unités de réservistes.
Secondly, I have reservist units with protection and intervention missions. They have very useful skills, which also undergo hardening. Just as the active duty army is getting tougher, our reserve is getting tougher, and it's an absolutely critical component for us.
Est en train de se durcir, mais c'est effectivement une composante absolument critique pour nous. Oui.
The Armed Forces Ministry currently has 40,000 operational reservists. This number is said to double over the next few years. Orion came to an end at the beginning of May, after 3 weeks of confrontation in the plains of eastern France. France plans to repeat the operation every 3 years. Therefore, the next step will be in 2026 for a new edition of this exercise.